Have you ever wondered about the early days of humanity and the very first family? Scholars and theologians have argued about these questions for centuries, leading to debates across various religious and academic circles. We know that incest would have been required in order to continue propagating the human species. But to what extent was this prevalent? And did Adam father children with his daughters? Today, we're going to go into both biblical and non-biblical texts to uncover the truth. By the end of today's video, you will have the complete answer to this question that is on the minds of many. Before we dive in, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss a video from us. To understand the context, we first need to revisit the creation story as told in the book of Genesis. According to Genesis 1 and 2, God created Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed life into him, making him a living being. Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden, a paradise filled with every kind of tree and creature. He was tasked with tending the garden and naming all the animals, but it soon became apparent that Adam needed a companion. God saw that it was not good for Adam to be alone, so he decided to create a suitable helper for him. Instead of creating another being from the dust, God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep and took one of his ribs, from which he fashioned Eve. This act signified the intimate and equal relationship between man and woman. Adam and Eve were not just the first humans. They were the archetypal couple, meant to live in perfect harmony with each other and with nature. Their life in Eden was very peaceful, until they disobeyed God's command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This act of disobedience, often referred to as the original sin, led to their expulsion from Eden. They were condemned to live in a world marred by pain, toil, and mortality. Despite this fall from grace, Adam and Eve remained the progenitors of the human race. Now, let's talk about their children. Genesis 4 tells us about their initial offspring, Cain and Abel. Cain, the firstborn, became a farmer, while Abel became a shepherd. Their relationship was marked by jealousy and tragedy. Cain, jealous of God's favor towards Abel's offering, killed his brother in a fit of rage. This act of fratricide marked the first murder in human history and led to Cain's further estrangement from his family and from God. After Abel's death, Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, who was born when Adam was 130 years old. Seth's birth was seen as a divine replacement for Abel, and his lineage is considered significant because it leads to Noah and eventually to Abraham, key figures in the biblical narrative. But Genesis 5:4 introduces a curious detail. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. These unnamed children form the crux of our inquiry. Who were these other sons and daughters, and is there any indication that Adam fathered children with his daughters? After all, there would have needed to be inbreeding within the first family in order to propagate the remainder of the human species. The Bible does not provide names or specific details about these children, leaving much to interpretation and speculation. But let's examine the canonical biblical texts to see what light they shed on this topic. The primary source is, of course, the book of Genesis. First, in the Genesis account, we have explicit mentions of Cain, Abel, and Seth. Cain's descendants are listed in Genesis 4, where we see a lineage that various figures who contributed to the development of civilization, such as builders of cities and makers of musical instruments. Unfortunately, Abel leaves no descendants due to his untimely death. Seth's line is detailed in Genesis 5, tracing his descendants down to Noah. However, Genesis 5:4 only briefly mentions that Adam had other sons and daughters without providing further details. We also need to consider the Levitical laws against incest found in Leviticus 18:6-18. These laws, given to Israelites much later during the time of Moses, prohibit sexual relations between close relatives. For example, Leviticus 18:9 states, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or born abroad." These laws reflect the societal norms and values of that time, aimed at maintaining family purity and avoiding genetic complications. However, it's important to note that these laws were established long after the time of Adam and Eve, and their applicability to the earliest generations of humanity is debatable. In addition, genealogical records in 1 Chronicles 1:1 and Luke 3:38 focus on notable descendants like Seth, who were significant in the biblical narrative. These genealogies often omit lesser-known family members, concentrating instead on key figures that lead to important historical and religious milestones. For instance, the genealogy in Luke 3:38 traces Jesus' lineage back to Adam, emphasizing the continuity of God's plan through critical individuals. The canonical texts clearly show that while Adam had many children, he did not explicitly father children with his daughters. The texts leave this aspect of early human relationships largely unaddressed, possibly because it was not seen as relevant or appropriate to detail such relationships explicitly. To gain more insight, we turn to non-canonical and apocryphal texts that expand on the stories found in the Bible. Though not part of the official biblical canon, these texts offer valuable perspectives and additional details that can help us understand the broader context of early humanity. Let's start with the Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text sometimes referred to as Little Genesis, because it retells the story of Genesis with additional details. According to Jubilees, Adam and Eve had a total of 9 sons and daughters. This text provides specific names for 2 of Adam's daughters, Awan and Azura. Awan is mentioned as Cain's wife. This adds a new layer to the story we know from Genesis. Imagine Cain, after the tragic incident with Abel, starting a family with his sister Awan. It gives us a picture of how the early human family might have expanded. Similarly, Azura is named as Seth's wife. Jubilee 4:1 states, "And in the 3rd week in the 2nd Jubilee, she gave birth to Cain. And in the 4th, she gave birth to Abel. And in the 5th, she gave birth to her daughter Awan." This sequence provides a timeline for when these children were born, adding structure to the narrative. The Book of Jubilees helps us understand that sibling marriages were necessary for humanity to grow at that time. It wasn't seen as strange or wrong because there were so few people on Earth. The text does not, however, explicitly state that Adam fathered children with his daughters. Instead, it focuses on how these sibling relationships were key to human multiplication. Next, we have the life of Adam and Eve, another apocryphal text. This text offers rich narratives about what happened to Adam and Eve after they were expelled from Eden. It delves into their feelings of remorse, their penance from the original sin, and their long return to Eden. For example, it describes the penance that Adam and Eve underwent for their sin and their longing to return to Eden, painting a vivid picture of their emotional and spiritual struggles. However, the life of Adam and Eve doesn't give much detail about the relationships between their children. Instead, it focuses on Adam and Eve's personal experiences and their direct interaction with God and the angels. This narrative highlights their humanity, making their story relatable as they grapple with the consequences of their actions and try to find a way back to God's favor. Other apocryphal sources, such as the Book of Enoch, also touch on Adam's lineage, but focus primarily on different aspects of early human history and heavenly interactions. The Book of Enoch is particularly interesting because it introduces the concept of the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth and fathered children with human women. These offspring, known as the Nephilim, were giants and mighty warriors. While the Book of Enoch doesn't provide much direct information about Adam's daughters, it adds to the broader context of early human history and the intermingling of the divine with the human. Now let's consider the theological and scholarly perspectives on this topic, which provide additional context and interpretation. Early church fathers and Jewish scholars have provided various interpretations of Genesis. Some, like Augustine of Hippo, suggested that incestuous relationships in the earliest generations were a necessity for the human race to expand. Augustine, in his work City of God, argued that such unions were initially permissible because the human race needed to multiply. He noted that as the population grew, such practices became unnecessary and were eventually prohibited by divine law. Other early interpreters maintained that Moses' law against incest reflected a later stage of moral and social development. Jewish scholars, such as Philo of Alexandria, also acknowledged the necessity of sibling marriages in the early generations, but emphasized that more stringent moral codes later superseded these practices. Modern scholarship views these early accounts with an understanding of their mythological and allegorical elements. Contemporary theologians and biblical scholars often emphasize the symbolic nature of the Genesis stories and the importance of interpreting them within their historical and cultural contexts. For instance, some scholars suggest that the early chapters of Genesis should be read as theological narratives rather than literal historical accounts. This perspective allows for a more nuanced understanding of the text and acknowledges the different literary genres present in the Bible. From an ethical and moral standpoint, the idea of incestuous relationships is troubling by today's standards. Modern ethics, informed by centuries of cultural, religious, and scientific developments, strongly condemn incest due to its social and genetic implications. However, in the context of early humanity, these relationships may have been viewed differently. The concept of sin and morality evolved influenced by culture, religious, and legal developments. Modern ethics also shape our interpretation of ancient texts. We must consider how our current values influence our interpretations of these ancient stories. It's essential to recognize that the biblical narrative operates within the framework of its own historical and cultural context, which can be vastly different from our contemporary perspectives. Our exploration into whether Adam fathered children with his daughters has taken us through various canonical and non-canonical texts, theological interpretations, and modern scholarly perspectives. The Genesis account provides us with the foundational narrative of Adam and Eve and their children, mentioning the existence of other sons and daughters without delving into specific details about their relationships. The Levitical laws against incest highlight later societal norms that may not apply to the earliest generations of humanity. Ultimately, it's unclear whether Adam fathered children with his daughters. The evidence leans towards the likelihood that he did not, and that Eve, as the mother of all, played a central role in humanity's early history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a video from us. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.